Welcome to Taboo Malta. It's a show that discusses taboo topics in the sunny island of Malta. So hello, we have Dr. Mary Muscat today. Could you please introduce yourself to our audience?
Hi, I lecture here at university with the Faculty of Laws. I'm at the Civil Law Department, so anything related to family law, child law, and advocacy would fall within my remit. Before that, I actually taught criminology at the Faculty of Social Wellbeing. I joined university, in fact, to lecture in policing and in enforcement. Because before becoming a lawyer, I spent 13 years within the police force. I was an inspector, and so I have hands-on experience on enforcement, on prosecution. So, but now I have basically retrained from criminal law to civil law. And I also work as a child advocate at the family court. And very recently, there was a vacancy within legal aid. There's a team of 3 lawyers that specializes on domestic violence issues. And I applied and eventually joined the team as well. So I try to do this kind of, I wouldn't call them part-time jobs. It's the practical part of the law, and specifically of family law, for the reason that you cannot just teach the subject. You have to live it in court, in that setting.
Wow, well done.
Thank you.
So since you mentioned that you have direct experience with the Malta Police Force and we're talking about domestic violence, why do you think it takes so long for women who are being abused to get protected by the police force?
In my time, it was even worse because there wasn't specifically an offence called domestic violence. You had to look at it from different angles, whether it was a physical injury, there were threats, and the myriad of tiny offences, the contraventions, and then altogether they would form what we now call domestic violence, which is also a legal term. So it was extremely difficult at the time, even to convince the officers of this reality. And eventually, with the Istanbul Convention, because that was the catalyst, not just for Malta, for basically other European member states that hadn't caught up yet with this reality. Because it's not easy to introduce a new cluster of offences, whatever they are. The same happened with money laundering, for example. And so the system takes time to catch up. Now, imagine that. So the legal system has to catch up in its own terms, and then it has to filter down to the enforcers. And then you have to deal with the culture of those enforcers and tell them, look, we have this new set of offences. We have to work on this. There's a standard order of procedures. You need to do this. You need to work with other agencies. Now, that is... those are uncharted waters, and when you have an agency where you're wearing a uniform and you take an oath of allegiance, you don't do that. You work, you're your own person, you only answer to your superior officers, and that's it. You don't work with other agencies. So again, there's a whole culture change that has to take place first.
Okay, and you mentioned that these are kind of new, but I don't think domestic violence is new in Malta specifically, right? And I read somewhere that it has doubled in a decade against women, specifically after COVID, because a lot of people were living together. So how do you think the police force can actually hurry up in a way? So we had cases, for example, with Bernice Kassar, We had in 2017 the murder of Daphne Caruana in Galizia. So there were cases of reporting to the police that they're being abused or they're being stalked. But to the public, it seems like they weren't actually protected. So how can we improve this?
Both domestic violence and violence against women, because the difference is the domestic setting. So the common element is violence against women, but if it is done within the domestic setting, then it's called domestic violence. So in the case of Bernice Cassar, who incidentally was someone I helped her, I helped in the co-supervision of her dissertation, because it was an analysis of a particular television series featuring a policewoman. And she was looking at the impact on actual police inspectors. And so I was helping her with that aspect. Look, first of all, there is a culture change. There is a patriarchy within the police. I had to deal with that myself. Even sometimes in being addressed correctly, it was difficult. When I joined, there were only 5 female officers out of a rank of 80. And I was either not taken seriously, even the public, when they would come, I was stationed at Valletta. So somebody would turn up, ask the orderly, can I speak to the inspector? And he would say, yes, knock on that door. And they would knock on my office door, and they would tell me, I need to speak to the inspector. Yes, take a seat. No, I need to speak to the inspector, not to the secretary of the inspector. So it just couldn't click. So imagine, so I was a female in that role. So imagine the victim, the perception of the victim. That was a long way that we had to walk first before actually. Even the Istanbul Convention was difficult. There was a certain difficulty where to implement it, to change these cultures. So there's a psychological aspect to it before introducing any form of law.
Okay, so we're looking at the fact that Malta's culture, traditions, and level of patriarchy is actually affecting, obviously, the society that we live in. And also the hierarchy within the system as well. So it's systemized in this discrimination.
Take, for example, harassment. I mean, it was introduced around 20 years ago. It was so difficult initially to show people, and especially men of a certain age, that you cannot just go up to any woman that you like and just do whatever, okay, or wolf whistle from across the road, because that's harassment. And even that was very difficult to enforce. So you would initially try to educate, but there's a certain extent to it. At some point, you need to enforce. So it is a difficult. It is doable, mind you. It's not quantifiable, so you cannot say, look, the level of difficulty is this because. Because the earned, it's a bit like crime prevention and like neighborhood watch. Is it successful? I don't know, but nothing has happened in the past year, so I suppose that it is successful because there weren't any robberies. So there's this difficulty, and no one so far, even within criminology, has found an answer for it.
Okay. And do you think there's a relation to the fact that they're short on staff, maybe that they're not responding to these calls as quickly as people would like?
Yes, that's definitely the point. And recently the minister said, as a result of the inquiry that was held, said, okay, from 44, a staff of 44, we're increasing it to 60. Okay, it's a start. It takes more than that. It takes... You need a good backup system. Even there was a court judgment, a constitutional court judgment, where a person, a woman who was reporting several instances of domestic violence, and because she filed reports at different police stations, they weren't communicating, so they didn't get the whole picture. They could. All they had to do was access the database that had the reports. And eventually, she filed a case for breach of human rights, rightly so, and she won it. And the court actually said, look, there were at least 3 entities. All they needed to do was communicate with each other. Just access the database, just switch on the computer and type in, not even her name, her ID card number, and all the reports would have shown up. It's your fault that you're not talking to each other. And as a result, she is suffering. So the state has to pay damages. Mm-hmm. So again, the system, the backup system, a lack of communication between different entities. You might say, but in this day and age, isn't it obvious? Even, I mean, the first thing you do in the morning is probably check your mobile. So, but you'd be surprised.
With this level of disorganization, are they taught, are they trained at some point that, listen, you need to communicate with one another, you need to update the files, you need to access systems. So this is done, for example, with doctors, like you were mentioning. So if I go to a different doctor, that's key in my ID card and just look at my history, So the same should be done in these cases.
There are different levels of training. There's the training at the initial level as a recruit. Mm-hmm. That's the common, most basic training that you can get. And then once you move to a special branch, it depends. If you join a special branch as soon as you have joined the police, that's difficult because you need some basic district training. It's supposed to be that way now, that you spend at least 2 years before joining. Because again, that was one of the problems. So imagine getting an 18-year-old who has absolutely no idea of life, what life has to offer. And then suddenly being thrown into all of this. And you cannot understand what it means to be verbally abused. It's like it wouldn't make a difference for the person. So again, then once a person moves to a special branch, then there's internal training. But look, with the massive amount of cases, with the kind of you need to be up to speed if you're going and spending the morning in court. You have to focus on your cases and forget whether there's anything new coming up. And then you go back and then you have to catch up and with the day and prepare for the next morning for court. So it's so intense that sometimes you don't really have time to train yourself to catch up on anything else except your workload. And it's not even enough because I've been through it.
Yes. So you said there's a staff of around 60, so we're saying just 60 for 500,000 people in Malta, for the population of Malta. My God.
It's still 44. It's going to be increased to 60.
Okay.
So honestly, where are you going to beef it up from? You're going to move people out of other areas then, other sections. So you're going to create a problem elsewhere. Again, and the number of new applicants, has been dwindling over the years. Over the 5 years, definitely. I used to teach criminal law at the academy to police recruits. We used to have 4 classes of like 28, 30 recruits each. Now, if you can, I don't know, I think it's around 2 classes maybe and 20 people each. So if you can manage to get enough recruits that have the basic standards at the end of the day.
And are they trained on how to deal with domestic violence cases, with the psychology and emotional intelligence that you need to deal with these cases, or not really?
They do. They have their training that is given by the inspectors from the different areas. So you would have cybercrime, because sometimes you need to link that as well with cybercrime. Okay, so cyberbullying, for example. I've seen these lecturers, and I know that they have exams, but then it's not just a one-off. You need to keep training for this, because it's not a question of developing a manual, because sometimes it has crossed my mind as a lecturer and an academic, should I maybe publish something along those lines? But it's something which you don't just get from books, so it wouldn't really solve the problem. You need constant training. I mean, people from and interaction between the agencies, because that is seriously lacking. Because once you get that going, then, for example, personally, I can observe what happens with child protection. Okay, it's definitely more successful because there has been interaction for a very long time, and it's like something which is. I'm not saying that it is neutral, but in relation to domestic violence, maybe people can deal with that within the police, because I've seen that. It's a personal observation. So maybe.
When you say agencies, what agencies? So the Malta Police Force working with?
As a group, it's called FSWS, Foundation for Social Welfare Services. So you would have the DV unit within FSWS. You would have also CPS, the Child Protection Services. You also have the VSA, Victim Support Agency. It's a new agency, and they also have their own social workers and case officers. And they also, because sometimes people go directly to the VSA rather than to the police. And in fact, there's also a memorandum of understanding with legal aid. So if they need a lawyer, they would VSA would inform legal aid as well.
All right. Okay. All right. Okay, that's very interesting.
And of course, there's court. There's just one magistrate who's dealing with all the cases.
Mm-hmm.
But even if you have two magistrates, I don't think it would be enough.
Okay, so basically it does boil down a bit to lack of staff, the actual attitude towards women within Malta and within the system, the lack of training. And then we've also got another tier, which is the complicated legal system. So in Malta, a lot of people say, I'm not even going to open a court case because it takes 10 years going up and down to court, filing a lot of papers, paying thousands of euros to lawyers going up and down. Why do you think we're in the state we're in? So abroad, if you'd have a legal case, you wouldn't, say that you're not going to do it just because of the time it takes. But in Malta, it seems to be impossible. So why do you think we've gotten to this state?
I think that the defense system is more equipped than the prosecution. It's easier to tear down a case rather than to build it, as the prosecution does. Obviously, it starts to collect the evidence and then starts to prove its point. And trust me, on the other side, it's easier because you just tear it down and you just instill doubt in anything that the prosecution says. So there are a number of strategies that have developed over time, and because I've seen it happen. So, for example, the more recent one is the I'm hearing voices in my head and demonic voices. Now people are like resorting to this because it's something new. Okay, it has worked in the other case. Shall I try it now? I might. It might work.
So we're talking about the Paulina Demska case where...
For example,
yes. Where most men are just saying, oh, they're crazy, going to Mount Carmel and not actually going to prison.
Exactly. Obviously, there's a procedure for it. So if you're claiming insanity of some sort, court experts have to be appointed, and they do their testing. And the procedure is well established. You have to do that at the preliminary stage before anything else is presented. You don't start prosecuting a case and then halfway through it, the defense says, oh, by the way, I forgot that my client has an insanity plea to file. No, you deal with that at the very beginning. And then the procedure follows from that. Is the person considered mentally unstable, yes or no?
And who carries that out? So I'm sure, okay, you're saying there's this psychological evaluation before they take it up to court, but a lot of men, like even with the Lisa Marie Zara case, a lot of men seem to be hiding behind that. Yes, obviously there are some mental health issues, obviously, that led them to do certain things, but they're not being reprimanded in the system, right?
You know what? The most common form of defense or attack by the defense is, when it comes to women, she's crazy. Trust me.
Oh, yeah, we're still going on with this. It's female hysteria.
I actually had a case
Oh, my God.
of forced marriage. And what do you think the parents said about their daughter? She's crazy. You know, so that is the most common form of defense. It's a strategy. It has been developed over time. It's been deconstructed and restructured in different and creative ways, but it boils down to the same defense, that she's crazy, yes. I've heard it so many times, even from police officers. So a woman would come and report a case, report an instance of domestic violence. Oh, she's always doing that. She's crazy. She has issues. And so they would just take it down as not as a police report, but as a civil case. It's just there for record purposes. I've seen it happen. And so you start questioning their evaluation. But who's making you an expert in psychiatry? How are you going to answer in court for that? If the defense has to ask you, like, okay, what did you do at that stage? And you know, so yes, I should write a paper about that because I've seen it so many times, even within my work as a child advocate. So I'm dealing with the children, and usually there's a care order, supervision order. The children are removed from their parents. And it's a case of usually the kettle calling the pot black. So one would be trafficking something. The mother would be prostituting herself. And one would say, you're a bad parent. And the other would say, you're a bad parent too. So they start like bickering. And then at one point, it always emerges, she's crazy. It's like, sometimes I start counting the minutes. Okay, let's see. And it's like, you know, when you place a bet. Shall we hear it in the first sitting or in the second? What do you think?
Oh my God.
Yeah, it's because it's very normalized. She's crazy. Yes, that's the most common description of a cause. The source of that behavior, because she's crazy, yes.
And obviously you've got other men accepting that and much understanding, but it's part of the culture to just sit with it.
Yes, and it happens across cultures. So it isn't just within the Maltese context. So I had a non-Maltese third country national situation, and I also heard that. It's across the board. Actually, I should write a paper about it.
And when they say she's crazy, so evoking the Berta Meason Mad Woman in the Attic Victorian hysteria episode, do they actually have to do a psychological evaluation on the woman to actually prove that she's crazy, or no, they kind of accept that and move on with the case?
When you have a lawyer who's sharp enough to ask for it, usually then it's nipped in the bud. Mm-hmm. But mind you, it's very difficult because the irony is this. Magistrates dealing with domestic violence cases are female. So try and say that before a female judge, a magistrate, or even judge in the family court. Oh, she's crazy, like, You're not saying that to me, are you? It's like,
Exactly.
because if you're thinking that about the one of the parties, then and mind you, the majority of lawyers working in the family court are female, so it's very difficult. It's like now it is nipped in the bud, mind you, because it's like, you're talking to me because we're all females here, like except you, maybe. But it's also, I've noticed this also in, for example, same-sex relationships. It's very easy. It's to accuse the other side of being crazy. Yes. I don't know.
So with two women, for example, you're
Yes.
saying?
I've
Is
seen that as well, yes. So woman against woman.
So it's internalized, basically, this within our culture.
It's definitely been normalized over the years, I suppose. Yes.
In fact, there was that case in the 80s where there was a child in a washing machine or something, and they said she was crazy.
I think it was even before that.
Even before that?
In that regard, I think they were right, because to do that to a child, they might have been referring to a psychosis that materialized in that way. But I hear this a lot within family court, juvenile court even, so.
But where do you think it comes from? Is it the lack of support that women get in society that kind of leads them to?
Lack of communication, because lack of understanding of each other. And because we're dealing with marriage, especially with marriage, obviously now we have more relationships and cohabitation and civil unions. But at the time, because marriage was the predominating model, people forget that it is based on reciprocity. And so a basic misunderstanding of reciprocity and a misunderstanding of genders and their roles. So the woman would be looking at the man as like some hairy female, okay, and expecting the man to behave like a female, but just with extra hair, okay, and the man thinking that the woman behaves like a man, but just has long hair or a bad hair day. So sometimes it is a question of communication, but so the easiest conclusion is to say that, oh, he or she is crazy. Okay, because you cannot understand something, then that other thing outside of you is crazy. It's not that you have the issue of understanding it. So that is the simplified version of it. Then you add on a layer of patriarchy. Then you add on a layer of ignorance.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. So if there are all these women in the system and as a magistrate in the court, why is it taking so long again? As in,
no, the workload. Look, in normal circumstances, there's always a certain percentage of cases that are in the waiting list. With COVID, it got so much. It's just catastrophic. I'm speaking from experience because the court was in lockdown twice for 6 weeks. Not just once. It's already bad. But then to have another lockdown for 6, that was just, I mean, even I as a lawyer, imagine, so even in a lockdown, the situation deteriorates, okay? It gets worse. Even if there's just a hairline crack, it just widens up. Statistically, we have known for a number of years that the highest incidence of domestic violence cases occur between Friday in the evening and Monday morning. Why? Because people are at home and they just bump into each other more often, because otherwise they would be away at work, for example. So in that kind of situation, then obviously the number spiraled. And the magistrate doesn't deal with domestic violence cases, the sitting on its own. She has juvenile court as well. And then she has the other general duties of a magistrate. So she would be on duty once or twice a month, and anything that happens, she has to appoint experts to conduct inquiries. So that's a lot of work. And then you have to have at least 2 days a week where you just sit down and write judgments. And that's why sometimes you hear that the court is empty on a Friday. Why aren't magistrates and judges in court on a Friday? It's like they are, but they're writing they're writing judgments, okay? And then you have shortage of court staff. So if you don't have your basic procedure in place, okay, so if you don't have your deputy, you don't have, or even a messenger, it's like, you cannot hold a sitting. It's that simple. I mean, I've been to court at 9 in the morning and there's a shortage of staff for some reason, even if they're stuck in traffic and on their way. You don't start the sitting unless there's everyone in place. And that is what angers me the most, because there is money for it. There are the resources. Just please, direct them towards the court. Start doing something about it, because you already have a certain burnout, because the kind of cases that you're dealing with, imagine, I mean, it's court at the end of the day. It's breaches of law. It's the worst side of humanity that you're dealing with on a daily basis. Okay? There's going to be burnout, and people are going to ask for a transfer to another ministry away from court, even if it's within justice, the justice ministry or department. And
so why don't they employ more staff?
Yes, good question. I don't know, honestly.
Very strange.
It's very strange, and there are the means to do this. You cannot say that there isn't the money. There aren't people who are qualified to do this. There aren't people who are qualified to teach and to show them the ropes. And yet we don't have it, yes. Even within the police, that, mind you.
One thing that I read, which was interesting, is that there's no law specifically on violence against women in Malta, right? So that was by Europe or EU.
It depends, because there is, first of all, but it might be called differently. Because I had a similar issue recently. I had to write a country report on Malta. And the people based in Brussels were sending me these standard questionnaires. And I kept saying, we don't call it like that. We call it by a different name. So if you Google search it, you're not going to find it. So it's going to turn up as a zero results. But we do have it. So it happened, for example, with hate crime. The legal term is racial hatred. I mean, if you search up racial hatred, it will turn up. But if you look it up as hate crime, it won't. And the same with child abuse. People are telling me, I would ask my students, for example, look up the sections on child abuse and we'll discuss them next week. And they would turn up. We didn't find any. Like, what did you search for? And I said, okay, child, did you search for minor, because it's a synonym for child, and abuse? Did you look up, for example, maltreatment, mistreatment, injuries, or whatever is it? And then they would actually look them up. I would make them look them up in the lecture. And like, okay, so we found them. So if you had to ask somebody from outside, so like from Brussels, what does the Maltese law say about child abuse? They would tell you there isn't any. Actually, there's a lot. So it's just called differently. So, for example, we have stalking, we have harassment, we have fear of violence. And, okay, they are listed under physical harm. And we have homicide, and now we have also femicide. So, and then the law is written in a neutral way, in a way that would apply to both male and female. We have female genital mutilation, for example. We have forced marriage. And again, the way it is worded, it doesn't say that the female is forced. It's neutral, because it could be the other way around. So, and now with different cultures, with different ethnic minorities living in Malta, that's a reality now. And I mean, I've seen it happen. And again, culture needs to catch up. The police culture, the internal one, needs to catch up with the reality outside.
In fact, there was a recent case that there was a spike in child marriages in a specific community in Malta, right?
Exactly. So again,
is this legal though?
Look, the age of marriage is 16. Yes. And as regards civil marriage, and the church has its own system and code, the canonical code, and it has also established it at 16. It was even less, mind you, yes. But that's historic. But then the bishops can set their own threshold. So they chose 16 to be in line with that of the state. And because girls can be as young as 14. Yes, and they can be married in the Catholic Church. That's according to the general code. But then it's up to the local bishop to decide. And so the Maltese bishops actually decided that it's going to be 16 to be in line with the civil state. And so what happens is in cultures, they have their own religious leaders. And yet they still bypass whatever their leaders say. Because I know that they tell them that, like, look, let's follow the laws of the country. And take that as a standard. But they still do. And there are different ways now of marrying by proxy, for example. So you can marry off somebody that is in a different country. Yes, so you're not physically together, and it's also available civilly, mind you. But nowadays with Zoom and whatever, I mean, you could actually see the person and do that in certain situations. But in these kind of cultures, what really worries me is that if forced marriage is real in our country, imagine female genital mutilation. So who is checking? Who's checking for this? Who's observing this? Who's in a position to do this within the police, for example? Who's holding the talks with ethnic minorities? Who's keeping tabs? Because that's what worries me. It's in the law, but it's not being enforced. Because I had a similar issue recently. I had a massive argument with a person with regards to environmental offences. Because there's a particular group of enforcers who have electronic equipment, and they give you the ticket, traffic offence ticket or environmental contravention there and then. Because they just input it in the system and you just get the printout. And they said, are all the offences inputted in the system, or is it just a small percentage? And then it transpired that it's only a part of a total number of offences. And I pointed that out and said, okay, so it's in the law, but nobody is going to enforce it because it's not on the equipment. So, okay, maybe I'm the one who asks these kinds of questions because I've been on both sides. As an enforcer and now as a lawyer and also as an academic, so I can see it from different angles. And then they eventually corrected it. But you
have to point it out.
Yes, somebody has to keep tabs.
Yes, okay. All right, so we're saying there's no direct law on domestic violence against women, but there is against domestic violence and harassment.
Look, there is. It's not maybe called domestic violence, or it has a specific subtitle for it, but there is. Especially if there are injuries, for example, then you just need to know how the criminal code works. But there is. What bugs me is that whoever is enforcing it doesn't know the difference between the physical violence, verbal, financial violence, okay, with withholding money. And there was a particular case in Gozo where the domestic violence, it was the parties were the father and the daughter. The domestic violence was also religious. Yes, because he would be telling her, pointing to the cross and saying stuff and saying you're doomed because... So there was this manifestation of patriarchy through religion, the expression of religion. Again, it's always that expression of patriarchy. So I sometimes try to explain to... let's call them clients, people who phone up legal aid. I try to explain to them the notion of reciprocity within marriage. And then I say, okay, so it's very basic. I give you a gift, and with that gift, you become a better person. And you're in a higher position now. So when the next time you're giving a gift, whether it's you're returning it to me or returning the gift exchange or to somebody else, you're from that higher position. And hopefully you're going to help the other person reach that higher position as well. That's reciprocity within marriage. It's more than just mutuality, because in mutuality, it's tit for tat. I give you this paper and you give me something equivalent. And the obligation is extinguished. But in reciprocity, it keeps going and until it becomes an upward spiral.
Okay.
Now, do you have that in your current situation with your partner, with your husband or whoever, like, because you have different regimes, the civil union, the cohabitation, and they say no. Tell me how you don't have it. Give me examples. And then they start realizing that, yes, that's abuse. And yes, that's domestic abuse.
Because it's not equal.
Because it's not physical, it's the other aspects. Because, I mean, it's easier to see the physical abuse.
Yes.
But the verbal violence, the financial violence, and anything else. And mind you, that judgment, that was in the Gozotin courts. And it wasn't actually a criminal case. It was a case where the daughter asked for damages, civil damages, because the father, through domestic violence, was keeping her from reaching her potential. And so it boiled down to, for example, I wanted to become, I don't know, a doctor. Instead, I became something completely different. So you calculate the salary of your current situation and the salary you would have obtained as a doctor. And there's a formula and you work it out, so it's an X amount of damages. And the case was based on that premise. And initially, I think it was something around 80,000 euros in the first judgment. And then on appeal, it was reduced to 40 because they said, look, the number of years was computed differently. So they took a longer time. So they said, like, for example, retirement is at 65, but in her case, it was at 60, something similar. So it was a case that was built along the lines of tort law rather than a criminal case. But I still use it when I'm lecturing, and especially when I'm giving speeches and talks and presentations to social workers working within, for example, the education ministry and different ministries. And I tell them, look, there has been this case. The court is already knowledgeable about the different kinds of domestic violence now. It's there. Okay, it's part of the case law. It's part of jurisprudence now. You cannot say that the court has never dealt with domestic violence, the verbal, the financial, and anything else. So it has no idea. It has now. There is a judgment.
And do you think this should be taught in schools? So should there be on how to protect yourself, so from an emotional, financial, and legal level, so before entering a marriage, for example? So recently there's been a discussion on prenups and how to legally protect yourself. But usually after women go through certain type of abuse, they cannot financially get a lawyer, for example, or they don't know what kind of help they should get in a situation because they would have signed something. Should we be educated on this as females?
Yes, definitely. Definitely. We don't have the culture of prenups. What we have is you either have the community of acquis, where once you get married, it's automatic. And you get a pooling of all the resources, whether movables and immovables. So movables would be cash, for example, the salary and income, and the immovables would be the place of residence and other property. You can either go for that. It's automatic once you get married anyway. Or choose the other regime called separation of estates. You can sign it before, but even during marriage, you can sign it at any time. And basically, it's a public deed. It's done before a notary. It's not very long. It's like a 3-liner, which says, from this point onwards, so-and-so is going to manage her income and her assets and is not liable for any debts that would be incurred by the other party. That's all it is. And then there's a third kind of regime where it's a mixture of both. So you would have the separation of estates when it comes, maybe you have a profession and you might be liable to a court case, to damages. So if you have the community of acquis, it would affect your spouse's patrimony, and it's not fair. So you would say, okay, when it comes to one's profession, then we have the separation of estates. We manage each separately. But when it comes to children, then we have the joint account. We have the pooling of resources. That is also doable. You go to a notary and you draw up the deed. What worries me now is that outside of marriage, when you have two people who are cohabiting, it doesn't cross their mind that there's such a thing as cohabitation, and you need to go to a notary and draw up a public deed. Because sometimes when I try to explain it, they say, but it's not romantic. He's going to think that I don't love him. Trust me, you need it right from the start. And if he loves you, it shouldn't be a problem. And it's now a legal obligation. So if you're cohabiting and you don't have this contract, you're in troubled waters.
So even renting we're talking about, or if you bought a place together, both?
Anything. As long as you're using your money and his money. Mm-hmm. I mean, it could be, again, a same-sex couple. Mm-hmm. It would still be applicable to even a civil union. I mean, civil union is just another name for marriage. So if you don't like to use the word marriage, use civil union. It's the same exact obligations as marriage, especially towards children. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. So first I would start off by educating people about reciprocity. Because in a marriage, that's actually the subject of my PhD, reciprocity in marriage. What does it mean? And how is it established? And you understand not just the positive reciprocity, because there's the negative reciprocity. So, for example, within marriage, the perverse version of the bond, the marriage bond, would be domestic violence, because that's a perversion of the gift. So reciprocity is about giving and making the other person a better person within marriage, and you're constantly giving and exchanging. So the perversion of that is domestic violence. Why? Because you're taking from the other person. You're withholding or withdrawing something. So you need to understand the red flags. But first, you need to understand reciprocity. That there's a positive, there's negative, and then what are the red flags? And basically prepare yourself as if you're entering into a contract, because at the end of the day, marriage, forget love, okay? You don't mean it's useless mentioning love in court, whether it's a court belonging to the state or the court belonging to the church for the annulment of marriages. It's not about love, it's about the contractual obligations. Did you fulfill the contractual obligations? Did you, when you were giving your consent, whether it's on the altar or before the registrar, for example, what were your intentions? Because if your intentions are vitiated and you're entering into a contract, then that contract is fraudulent. It boils down to a contract. In fact, even Pope Paul VI actually said at one point, and caused an uproar. And it reminds me of the Tina Turner song, What's Love Got to Do With It? And he said, actually, marriage and love, it's not about love. Marriage is about the contractual obligations. Full stop. Okay. I mean, and he used the example of buying a house. And he actually said in his speech, when you're buying a house, you know what the obligations are. Is it important to love the house? I mean, it would be better to love the house, obviously, but you don't need to love the house. You need to fulfill the contractual obligations in taking care of the house and the maintenance and seeing that there aren't any latent defects that would, again, vitiate the whole contract because you're selling me something that doesn't exist, you know? So I think people need to be educated along these lines because we're just drawn by the romantic side of films and movies and whatever and fiction.
And with your experience working in the police force and on the legal side as well, when it comes to child abuse and domestic violence, have we improved in that aspect? So we had even cases where, for example, with Bernice Cassar, she was killed and they said that the kids were orphans. So there was an article really quickly that they would be put into the system and then the grandparents had to...
Mela, with regards to the Bernice case, what was worrying was that before the magistrate's court, the DV sitting, the court said that there is a protection order. I think the father cannot contact the children. Before the family court, the court decree said, yes, he has a right to access so many times a week, and even sleepovers are permitted. That's the same court. So one is the magistrate's court, the DV sitting, and the other is the family court. In their case regarding separation. And they weren't communicating. And that came out in the Valencia inquiry report. Now, it's about 70, 80 pages, but only the last 10 pages are actually accessible to the public. Because those are the recommendations, the private details, obviously, with GDPR and everything else, you cannot access that. But it was mentioned in the recommendations that the courts need to talk among themselves. They need to communicate. It's as bad as within the police. So, yes, there needs to be, I don't know whether it can be done through a database or I'm not a tech expert, but I'm sure that there is a way of doing this.
Well, we're in 2023, so I'm sure we have the technology and the resources, just need to use them, right?
Look, COVID pushed the courts in that direction. They started using Teams, and now in every single courtroom there's a huge monitor, and you can actually even testify. Let's say you're a doctor and you cannot leave your practice. The court secretary would send you the link, and then you would testify, for example, at noon.
Over Zoom or something.
Exactly.
Yes, okay.
So now it's doable. Even the most, because I knew of judges who were completely terrified of this technology, but by now it's becoming normalized. So yes, there's more to be done.
Also, there was a case in LA, if I'm not mistaken, where an AI robot was presented as the legal defense for someone. Do you think this will become a thing or it will catch on?
We use technology in the sense of CCTV footage. So if that classifies as electronic evidence, one has to look into it and see whether it is acceptable by courts.
Okay. All right. Do you have any final comments that you'd like to make? That's how, as the public, we can maybe improve the system slightly.
Look, we need to know our rights, okay, and the dynamics of abuse. There's a phrase that I like to use with students. It's called frog boiling. How do you boil a frog? Okay, a frog leaps out of something and can just run away. You don't put a lid on it, by the way. I'm not a I'm not a cook, but I know that the analogy is related to this because when you place a frog in water, I mean, a frog takes to water. Obviously, it's an amphibian. It will tolerate the rising temperature for a while, and it just keeps tolerating and tolerating until it's too late for the frog to jump out because the frog's energy would have drained because it would be so hot that it doesn't have enough force in its hind legs to leap out. That is frog boiling, and it's something which is being used not in academic circles, but it's a very apt description of the escalation of domestic violence and a certain manipulation and how the victim would be in denial. So we need to be aware of this dynamic situation that can happen to us even in other areas of our life, not just domestic violence. So that is part of the red flag or series of red flags that we need to be aware of. And educated, we need to be really educated in saying no when it happens. I don't know how many times I have spoken to women and they would tell you, I spent a year with no salary because I was on maternity leave, for example. And I was always afraid to ask him for money. Why? Because I was ashamed to ask, but it's your right. You have a right to half of his monthly salary there and then. You whatever income he's bringing home, he have a right to half of it, even if you have separation of estates. If you're in that situation, he still is legally obliged to support you. It's in the law. So, yes, education along those lines.
Women need to be more aware of their rights, like you're saying, and that a relationship, any type of relationship, is consensual and that there is help and you can speak up. So even if you can't afford it, there's Victim Support Malta, like we mentioned.
Yes.
There's legal aids even at university, like you were telling me. You just, like you said, you just have to realize, I don't think we're taught about red flags in relationships and what healthy relationships are, going back to social media and films, and I think that
the happily ever after,
Exactly.
the fairy tale. It's imprinted in us.
Yes.
And we keep hoping. So hopefully now with mixed secondary schools, it should be easier because it would involve everyone then. And not just, I attended a girls-only school in secondary, so I suppose many people my age did that. So it's came much later when I had my own daughter. So that was the beginning, basically. And my daughter is 15, so it's a very recent development. So now maybe the education system needs to adapt to the situation and reach more people because it's a mixed system. Because it boils down to a question of communication. Because then again, I see situations where women emasculate men within a marriage, okay? And I've had instances where the client was a man, and generally it's not just the wife who is abusive, even the children, because then that's a different dynamic. So, and they are just as bad and as heart-wrenching, trust me, because when you start hearing how the person would be basically pushed into living into just one room and not even being able to exit and have a cup of coffee, and it's bad. Whoever is at the other end of it, who is at the receiving end. So yes, education from a young age. I hope I have answered your question.
Yes. Thank you. Thank you so much. All right. This is the end of the session. Thank you everyone for watching. If you'd like to get in touch, I'm going to put the details down below in the video. Thanks.